Hello and welcome to On Deadline. I'm Dennis Owens.
I'm Kendra Nichols.
And I'm Amanda St. Hilaire. Thank you for joining us.
If you're listening for the first time, we are journalists for ABC 27 News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
But on this podcast, we talk about issues that affect people all over.
These are the conversations you don't hear on the news. We're going more in depth and behind the scenes.
We're different generations with different ideas, and we don't always agree. But we do get very personal, get very real, and hopefully get you thinking.
And we're recording on November 6, 2017, and today we're discussing juvenile lifers, that is, people sentenced to life for crimes they committed before reaching the age of 18. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional. And everybody probably says, okay, no mandatory life for juvenile convicts moving forward. But what about the many who were sentenced as juveniles and got mandatory life and are sitting in prison? Pennsylvania had 500 of these, by far more than any other state. I've been reporting on them. Just last week, 2 in our area. On Monday, a man who spent nearly 50 years behind bars. He was robbing a bank in Harrisburg in 1968. A customer tried to stop it, was shot and killed. The first assistant DA, Fran Chardo of Dauphin County, said, I wanted him to die in prison until I met him. He's been a model prisoner and role model for other inmates. He has been resentenced. That happened last week to 40 years. And as soon as the paperwork is properly processed, he will be released. But in Lancaster County last week, a man who killed and tortured his own parents as a juvenile got a new sentence. It wasn't life, but it was 80 years. So unless he lives a really long time, he is likely to die behind bars. Those are just 2 cases of hundreds in Pennsylvania. To help us discuss the issue, we have 2 terrific guests today. Tasha Williams is just months away from graduating from Widener Law. Congratulations on that. But for years, you've poured yourself into criminal justice issues in general, juvenile lifers specifically. Welcome, Tasha.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Frank Vaccaro, whose brother-in-law, a brother-in-law he never met, in fact, was 11 years old when a 16-year-old neighbor sexually assaulted and murdered him in Cumberland County. He is going to be the voice for all the families of victims all across the Commonwealth dealing with this U.S. Supreme Court ruling. And Frank, I want to begin with you because most people I talk to, whether it's the head of the Department of Corrections, John Wetzel, or DAs, they say number one is remembering victims in all of this. And I want you to represent the many victims who've now had to deal with this over the past year. 81 people, I think, have been released in the past year that were juvenile lifers. Talk about the difficulties of being a family member of a victim and having to revisit these cases.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Dennis. My wife and sister-in-law, who are the only remaining survivors of Stephen Turner, the problem is going through this is the most horrific experience anybody can imagine, obviously. But the problem is having to relive this again when they thought that this was all behind them. It's a lot of issues come up with, people who were around back then. The parents, Steve's parents, are both now gone, and they went to their graves with the knowledge that they thought, at least some small semblance of justice had been given to their son. Nothing was going to bring him back, but they could at least rest in peace, thinking that there had been some kind of justice. Now, unfortunately, this is like stealing that justice and all the hard work from the prosecutors, the detectives, everybody who helped make sure that this person was put behind bars.
Now, this case, it was 16-year-old John Waters. Stephen Turner was the victim. John Waters he sexually assaulted and murdered, beat to death Stephen Turner. So this was an especially heinous crime. The U.S. Supreme Court did not rule that you automatically have to let everybody out. They said they have to get resentenced, and as you saw in Lancaster County last week, the resentence was 80 years, which is in effect a life term.
Exactly.
So tell me, and this case, I believe November 13th, so next week we're going to have a hearing on this.
Yeah.
Family nervous? Tell me what's going on.
Yeah, we've been trying to get ourselves organized to. We have some online petition. We have paper petitions. We've worked with the parents of murdered children to help circulate some petitions there. Just the online petition alone is almost at 2,000 signatures now in the course of a month. We're reaching out through social media, but the concern for us is that there's always that chance because the new sentencing guidelines only require 35 years. He's served 36. There's that possibility he could be out.
And he is 52 years old, and we did a story on it, as your wife said, 52 still has a lot of life to live.
That's
and,
right.
And Stephen Turner didn't get a chance to live that life.
That's right. And the bigger concern, it's not just about stealing the justice that we fought so hard for Stephen, 36 years ago. Beyond that, there's the concern about, there have been multiple studies done, the Department of Justice has them on their websites, regarding 20-year longitudinal studies of sexual offenders. The rate for recidivism on these guys is well over 50% according to some of these studies. So I just feel like it's almost flipping a coin and looking at the community and going, heads you lose, tails you're safe. And I just don't think that's the kind of security we expect. A society has a duty not just to protect innocent people who aren't guilty and not putting innocent people in jail. It has a duty to protect innocent children and families.
So it sounds like you're worried not just about justice and safety, but the actual process, because that digs up so much. Like you were saying, it's like that sense of closure that was taken away. But are you also concerned that since we're further removed from the actual crime, sometimes there's an emotional aspect of it that plays a role in the sentencing that can get lost over the years?
Absolutely. Like I said, the siblings feel a loss that is indescribable, but for a parent to have to bury their own children from something this horrific, they're not there to stand up in court and explain what this did to them. It tore apart a marriage. It tore apart a family. For 10 days, that community was terrified, because for 10 days they knew there was a sexual assault of a child and a murder, a brutal murder, but nobody knew who it was. So for 10 days, that whole Hampden Township area was terrified. There was talk about, do we cancel Halloween? People don't want to be out in the streets. It was an idyllic time. For those who don't remember, it was not unkind. I was old enough to be, in fact, Stephen would have been my age. You would go out and play until literally it got dark and come home. Mm-hmm. And that's something that whole area lost. And not just for 10 days. They lost it forever, because then they were terrified.
That was October of 1981.
Did he ever apologize to the family sometimes?
There was a letter that he wrote on the instructions of his attorney that he, while the court process was going on, that he gave that was delivered to the parents, that I understand they read. They never shared with the children, because at that time the siblings were only 13, and Stephen was 11 when he was killed, but Melissa was 13 and Sherry was 16, and they, it was a little too much for them. In fact, there's a lot of details that have come out since then, because again, the parents protected the children to a certain degree about the details of the assault.
Which are horrific.
Horrific, and they, of course, never knew. And
your wife, which would be Stephen's sister, she said there was things she just learned recently within the last couple of months that she wasn't even aware of.
Oh, and that's the thing, too, is not only did it reopen the old wounds, it kind of made them a little worse, because now as an adult, you need to dive into a little deeper. If you're going to protect your deceased brother's justice, then you need to get in there and know everything you can. And that's where I've come in, is that it's been very, very painful for them, and I've done my best to help champion that for them, where these interviews are really hard. And so I try to help out where I can.
And then the other frustrating thing is you have two daughters that never got to meet their uncle.
No. And it helps shape them, too. And in some ways it's negative, and in some ways it's positive. But I mean, the paranoia that, every parent gets concerned about their kids, of course. But, when you're 5 minutes late and your mother's in tears and calling on the phone, there's a reason why. It makes it a little more easy for you to forgive and understand, why does she not want me to cross the street and go out and play by myself? Well, there's a very real memory attached to that. Same thing with her sister. They have a nephew, too, who's Nicholas would be 27. He's named after Stephen. And, it influenced him as well. He became a pastor in no small part because the family had some, they struggled a lot with, how can God let something like this happen? And, when a 9-year-old sits you down and goes, why would God let someone kill my uncle at 11? He's completely innocent. How do you explain those kinds of things? And it helped lead him to become a pastor. And my younger daughter has always had an interest in medicine and pre-med. We never told her about this until she got a little older. When she heard about it, on her own, she's, I want to get into forensic science because I want to save other families from what my mommy went through. And my other daughter, she wants to get into politics because she wants to make sure laws like this and, things like this where the judges are overreaching and trying to legislate from the bench, some would say, that sort of thing doesn't happen.
Let's turn to Latasha for just a moment. You mentioned overreaching, and from the bench, you have been studying this issue for a long time, and you and I worked together on a story about Giovanni Reed, who got life as a juvenile for second degree, meaning he was there when a man was murdered, but he's not the man who pulled the trigger. And he got life, and if not for this Supreme Court ruling, he'd still be sitting behind bars by all likelihood. But we can point out, through no small measure of your own efforts, he is free today. He got out on Labor Day. We were with you as that happened.
Yes.
And he did serve. I mean, nobody's suggesting he was innocent. He did serve 26 years behind bars for this murder, where he was there, and he's from Philadelphia. So give me the side of what this Supreme Court ruling has done for some of these people who have gotten out.
Well, I think that the ruling was very important, just in terms of addressing the mandatory nature of sentencing in Pennsylvania and other states around the country. And you take a case like Stephen's murder, and it's just horrible what happened to him. But when you look at his case against the backdrop of other cases in Pennsylvania and throughout the country, not every juvenile case mirrors what happened in Stephen's case. And when you have a blanket rule that affects all juveniles convicted of murder, I think the result ends up being unfair sentencing, because in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure other states, we do have felony murder, where, like you said, it's murder in the second degree, where the person who didn't pull the trigger is held equally accountable and responsible as the person who did pull the trigger. And I do believe that there is some truth in that juveniles do not have or possess the same skills that adults have in terms of decision making, being able to foresee the consequences of their actions, being able to foresee that if they participate in a felony, whether that's a burglary or a robbery, that the end result could be the loss of life. And so I think it is important to take all of those factors into consideration and punish each juvenile on an individual basis, so that people are not subjected to mandatory sentencing when the facts of each case are very different.
Frank, I see you nodding.
Well, I think Natasha brings up a good point. I don't think it's without merit that, there are some cases, and Giovanni's, I think, an excellent textbook case of where someone who's second degree, maybe there's something that, to Dennis's point, he did pay his penalty to society. He sat in jail for what he did because what he did was wrong. But there's no saying he had knowledge of it. There's no, again, I think sitting back in armchair quarterbacking cases is a dangerous thing to do in general. And I think maybe that's something we need to look at, that, the sentencing guidelines need to be looked at a little more closely. That's fair.
I'm curious. You said there was 80 released?
81.
81.
Yes.
And I don't know if you know this or not. Of those 81, do we know if any of them were the person that pulled the trigger, so to speak?
Do we have that breakdown? I know none of them have been run afoul of the law. Now, it's relatively recently they've been out, but none of them at this point of the 81 have reoffended in any way. That we know of.
I'm just curious if any of the 81 actually did.
I think there are a couple of people that were murderers, and in fact, the one that in Dauphin County last week, he was resentenced to time served, was a trigger guy.
Mm-hmm. I think there are some people out there, and I hear what you're saying. As a juvenile, you might not always have the best understanding.
And that was the basis of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. That is, the male brain is not fully formed, or the I shouldn't just say male, although we know
It's the male brain ever fully formed.
Sometimes the male brain isn't fully formed at 55. Okay, so let's be clear on that.
But the idea is if your brain isn't fully formed enough where, we're not going to let you drink till you're 21, why is it fully formed enough to be sentenced?
And a mandatory life.
And I think that there are people that are going to say if you take a life, you take a life, whether you're 17 or 19. I think there's still people out there that believe you still know that taking a life is wrong at 17, just as you do at 19. So why are we now going back and saying the 17-year-old? I mean, there's still people that are going to argue that.
And then you also have the
nothing magical
wicket.
happens. Yeah, nothing magical happens when you hit your 18th birthday.
So how do you respond to those people that are like, why is at 17 you didn't quite understand taking a life's not okay. But
Well, it's funny you bring this up because in Giovanni's case,
Right.
there was another guy who wasn't the trigger man who was just over 18 or he was 19, right?
Right, and
So
had a different
he was
sense.
19, Giovanni
So how
was
do
under
you- how do you
17. And
explain
by
that?
the way, he's still in jail serving life without
Right.
parole.
It's funny that you should mention that because there are a couple of cases in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court awaiting review because the young people who were convicted in those cases were ages 19 and I think maybe 22. And so the question becomes, at what point do we cut off this age? Because like you said, Frank, nothing magical happens when you turn 18 as far as developmentally. And so I think it's a question that our courts are going to have to answer in the very near future, if not in Pennsylvania, certainly at the federal level, because as Dennis just said, in Giovanni's case, there was another co-defendant who did not pull the trigger, who was 19 years old, and he remains in custody for the rest of his life. And so, you know, at some point there needs to be a fine line drawn. And I think, you know, saying 18 from a policy perspective is what makes it easier because, you know, when will it stop? Will it be age 20, age 24, age 27? At what point do we agree that the brain has fully matured and fully developed?
But see, that's my problem with that, is that, you know, it's not the job of the judiciary to do anything except call the balls and the strikes. It's the job of the legislature, as the representatives of the people, to sit down and go, 18 is old enough because you can get drafted and go kill and get killed for your country. 21 is really some silly arbitrary number for being old enough to drink. So, but if 18 is old enough to do all that, and the legislature said so, who is the judiciary to say anything else other than 18 is fine, 18 is not fine? If the legislature passes laws saying, which they just did pass some resentencing guidelines, if you're 14 to 6, I think it's like 13 to 15, you get this many minimum, 16, 17, you get this many minimum. If that's what they want to say, who's the judiciary to turn around and second guess them?
So you feel like there's legislating from the bench?
That's absolutely what it is. And same thing with this case of the Supreme Court. Even in this decision, I mean, it's the law of the land. You have to accept it. That's what it is now. Until maybe in 3 or 4 more years, we get another justice on there who believes differently. Another case goes up. They could reverse it all tomorrow, which is the dangerousness of this legislating from the bench. They said that the Constitution prohibits you against having cruel and unusual punishment. There is nothing cruel and unusual about getting life in jail because a bunch of psychologists somewhere found a study that says your brain's not fully developed. Okay.
Well, to be fair, it is more than a study, and to be fair, it is their job to interpret the law of the land, which I understand that we talk about fine lines a lot on this show and in this episode in particular. But there is a fine line when your job is to interpret that law, and it is more than one study.
Well, but that's what I'm getting at, though, is that they're saying that the brain's not fully developed and therefore it's cruel and unusual. But if it's a law and it's allowed in, I believe it's around 30 states, it's allowed to do that, then why it's not unusual, then who are they to say it's cruel? If that's what the people have dictated to their legislatures, is okay to put a juvenile in jail without life without parole, you know, then who are they to say otherwise?
Well, now, just to be clear, they didn't say that life in prison for a juvenile is unconstitutional. True, it's the mandatory nature of it that makes it unconstitutional. There are cases where these juveniles have gone up for resentencing and been resentenced to life without parole again. And so
there are some narrow parameters in which that can happen, though. They're very strict.
Well, yeah, but they made it almost impossible. I mean, so far...
But I just told you last week in Lancaster, 80 years to a 17-year-old, that's the equivalent of a life sentence.
It is de facto life.
Yeah, and that, but then again, we're relying on a judge to make a good call. But if the minimum sentencing is set in such a way that it can't happen, like, so if that judge had said, nah, 30 years is fine, he could be out. We're relying on a judge, which is why they had the minimum guidelines to try to prevent a crazy judge, you know, hey, you molested a whole kindergarten classroom full of kids, but 5 years is fine because you seem really sorry. So again, we have to strike that balance, as Tasha and I were talking about earlier, actually, before you came in. It's hard to hit that balance.
Now, regarding those minimum guidelines, there is an argument, I don't know if it'll ever be resolved, with regard to how these minimum guidelines are being interpreted and enforced, because These are sentencing guidelines that came out after the Miller decision came down in 2012. So by law, those sentencing guidelines should only affect cases moving forward, not cases as we look back retrospectively. And typically what would happen is we would look to what legal sentencing scheme was available at the time these crimes happened back in the past. Unfortunately for Pennsylvania, there was no legal sentencing scheme. It's only been life without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder and second-degree murder. So there are a lot of us who are not even in agreement with courts using current sentencing guidelines to apply to these cases from the past, because you can't enforce the law backwards, only moving forward. And so I don't know if that issue is going to make its way up through the Pennsylvania courts, but they're using these sentencing guidelines of 35 to life and 30 to life and 25 to life and 20 to life, depending on the age of the offender and the degree of murder. But I'm of the opinion that they should not be doing that.
Right. Well, but again, like the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, when they initially, I think it was Philadelphia, tried to shortcut it and went, fine, we're going to resentence them all to life without parole because it says you can. So they tried that, and I think in that case, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court fairly said,
nice
no,
try.
You can't do that. You need to look at them individually.
And again, as we're having this discussion, it's a case-by-case basis.
And that's fair.
And
absolutely.
should be.
Absolutely. I think they were right there. But the problem is that ruling, when they came down, what they also said, it's the job of the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond all reasonable doubt, that person is beyond reform before they give them life without parole. Well, that's resulting in 90%. According to the Department of Corrections website, 90% of the people reviewed so far have been set free. Now, that's outrageous.
Well, I've talked to several district attorneys who hate that clause, by the way, because they said it's almost impossible to prove. How am I supposed to prove that someone is?
Exactly.
There's no chance that,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what's going to happen? For instance, it's Waters, correct, his resentencing hearing. Let people know what's going to happen. Do they actually review every detail of the case? Is the judge just doing? I don't know if you want to walk us through that, or how. I want people to understand how the process works. Are they really looking at every detail? I mean, how does that work?
Well, I know, speaking on my experiences out of Philadelphia County, because of the disproportionate number of offenders from Philadelphia County, I think there's over 300 out of the 500, all held from Philadelphia County. For policy purposes and judicial economy, the prosecutor's office is looking to offer deals, if you will, so that these offenders can, look at what's being offered to them and then decide if they want to take the sentencing deal or move to what they're calling a contested sentencing hearing. And at these contested sentencing hearings, there's mitigation evidence that is presented before the court. There are a team of different defense lawyers, different mitigation experts in Philadelphia who are putting together packages of information for these offenders. They're pulling up their education records. They're pulling up their history with the Department of Corrections to see, what kind of life they've lived behind bars. And these witnesses are presented before the court, and then the court determines what that person's sentence will be.
I can tell you on the Waters case, and speaking with Cumberland County District Attorney Dave Freed, and the attorneys, by the way, didn't really want to talk much to tip their hand, but there will be, she used the right word, contested hearing, and Dave said, I have to go into a contested hearing. We're going to see what the other side says. And Waters' attorney is kind of an interesting thing, is Royce Morris, who is running for judge. And so he didn't want to comment on this. Of course, when you have a political situation and you're running for judge, I don't think being the attorney who's trying to get a guy who's serving life
the optics aren't great.
The optics aren't great for voters, and I can say this because this really doesn't drop until after the election, so it's not going to affect that. But nonetheless, everybody needs to be represented, right? But there's going to be a contested hearing in which they go in and argue it.
And your family
Dave,
will have a voice.
Yeah.
Well, and Dave Freed said to me, in looking at it cursorily, he hasn't spent enough time behind bars. That was the quote he used in our story. So he's going to push certainly for more jail time.
So what role does mental health play in all this? Because when we're talking about a particularly heinous crime, that's not just a case of bad judgment or a not fully developed brain. There's clearly something much stronger at issue here when it comes to that. So how does that affect this whole process?
Well, I can, if you don't mind, I can tell you from my discussions with the Cumberland County DA's office is exactly what Letitia mentioned, is that they do have the mitigation package that they're going to put together. And what is typically done, and he says we'll have to see, they were getting it together, hopefully we'll see it any day, only a week to go, I'd like to see it soon, but they said they'll take a look at things like she said, what kind of education class, did he take anger management classes, did he take how not to be a sexual predator, I don't know what classes that would be, but then they'll have a psych evaluation done in all likelihood if they think it benefits them. Now, of course, if the psych evaluation doesn't benefit them, I'm sure they'll leave it out of the package, but that they'll present that. So our contention is, I certainly hope something's being done to check on him before he's going to be let out. But I imagine, the district attorney, again, without tipping their hand any, they're probably going to push for more. But technically, as Alicia said, that look, the settings and guidelines would only require him to have, the judge could theoretically say, well, guidelines say 35 years, you've spent 36, go see the parole board, you're out. Which is highly unlikely.
Because no judge wants to be the one who lets someone out and then that person immediately reoffends. And that's another piece that can kind of get caught up and
which
get
is
lost
kind of a political
in this
component
discussion.
Too, because you don't want it on your record
it
that
is
you let somebody out.
It is more politically advantageous for a judge to keep someone in, and especially for elected, when we're talking about elected judges, when we're talking about elected district attorneys, the way you prove you're doing your job is how many people you lock up and how long they stay there. So it is politically advantageous for that system to keep going.
That's true. And Frank actually brought up a good point. I think there's sort of like a double layer of protection because, even if the courts were to sentence the offender in your family member's case to a sentence that would be sort of a time served, he still has to see the parole board. And so the parole board could deny parole each and every time he is up for review. So I think that's important to consider, and I think parole does, an examination of, what he has done, what his background is, what his mental health issues may or may not be, given the graphic, nature of the crime he committed, that the parole board is in place too. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
But that does mean the family then, every time that person is up for parole, is going through that all over again because, people will go and they will speak.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
My question, when the U.S. Supreme Court made this ruling, and I don't know the specific number, it was about 1,200 across the country, but like 500 of them are here. Pennsylvania has an unbelievably high number. Why is that?
I think it's because of our laws. I think they're draconian to an extent. And I think it's the mandatory nature of our laws. I think that there was this push, and looking at Pennsylvania, but also let's shift over to Philadelphia County for just a moment. A lot of these cases, happened during a time where there was this big effort to just lock people up. Philadelphia County.
Talking 90s, late 90s?
Maybe late 80s, early 90s. Lynn Abraham, who has been called the DA of death. Take that for what it's worth. She sat in her position as district attorney of Philadelphia for, I think, about 20 years. And so when you look at, when a lot of these cases happened, it was during a time where people were sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they just locked these young people away. And so I think also because Pennsylvania is a state where second-degree murder also calls for a mandatory sentence of life without parole, that's probably a big part of the reason as to why we have the numbers that we have.
Go ahead.
I know there's at least someone listening to this right now thinking, it's really hard for me to muster up sympathy for people who did do something wrong and had a penalty for doing that. So what is the overall societal point of having this conversation, especially for people who may not be family members of victims of crimes or who may not know anyone who's locked away? What does that mean for the rest of society who may think, you know what, this doesn't affect me? Keep them locked up. It sounds like it's a lot safer.
I think that anyone who works every day and pays taxes every day is affected by this problem, whether they realize it or not, because it's very costly to house, feed, guard people who are incarcerated for the rest of their lives. And we're at a point now where people who were once younger people sentenced to life without parole are now older people with geriatric issues, health concerns. And so, for every day that they spend incarcerated in a state facility, we're paying for that. And in my opinion, it does not make us any safer. Now, that's generally speaking. There are situations where horrific crimes, such as with Stephen, were committed. And, in situations like that, I would hope that the courts and the parole board would really take a deep look into the situation to determine whether this person is redeemable, whether or not there is an underlying mental illness. And, my initial thoughts are that someone who would commit such an act at the age of 16, something like that probably happened to him. And so, it's a systemic issue that needs addressing. What made this person commit this act against Stephen? That's troubling for me as well.
So we're treating the symptoms right now and not the source of the problem.
I think so.
Okay, but that's a job for the legislature to do. And I'm just, if it's expensive, if you think it's expensive to keep criminals locked up, try letting them all out and see what kind of toll it takes on society. The purpose of incarceration is to deter crime. It works. It really does. Now, maybe there's a component of the prison system we need to look a little closer at. How do we, if somebody's in there for a shorter term for a drug possession charge, or perhaps they were, a drug addiction.
Offenses.
Yeah, maybe we need to look at mandatory, get rehab. Maybe we need to look at mandatory GED before you're even considered to get out. Job training, things like that for low-level offenses. Then second-level offenses, if you're a repeat offender, obviously you didn't get the hint. Make jails less luxurious. I have nothing wrong with breaking the old-fashioned way of breaking big ones into little ones, word work, all that stuff. If they're working their butts off, maybe they'll think twice. They say, gee, jail's not so fun. Now they have libraries, they have gyms, they have internet in some cases. Maybe we need more of a two-prong approach. And in the defense of the district attorney, she's simply enforcing the laws that are out there, passed by our representatives. If we don't like it, we think they're too draconian, then we need to get out there and campaign to let's lower the penalties for these things. But then what kind of message is that sending? So it's a difficult position to be in, but the district attorneys are doing their jobs to keep us safe.
They do have leeway, though, to be fair. So, for example, I'm looking into one particular county and their jail population, and someone with a first-time low-level drug offense is getting bail set at $50,000. There is an argument to be made, and I don't want to get too off the rails talking about low-level offenses because that's not really what we're talking about here. There is an argument to be made that when you do that, you can almost manufacture an even worse criminal because you're taking someone and putting them in an environment with people who have done a lot worse. Mm-hmm. Obviously, what we're talking about right here is the higher level offense, but I do want to point out that the district attorney has leeway in terms of what they ask for, what they push for. The judge is the final determination, though.
But I think that's the concern here. I don't think many people would argue that these cases should be looked at a case-by-case basis. They're not all the same. I think what I'm feeling here is that the concern is that some might slip through the cracks if the judges or these parole boards aren't doing the right thing. Could a murderer be out on the street again?
Well,
and I think that's the concern.
Either way, if you have a lot of leeway, right, where someone is getting locked up for a really long time who maybe shouldn't be, and how much better is that making the problem, or is someone being let out and posing a danger and a threat to society?
Well, and that's the other side of that whole argument. Tasha talked about the expense of keeping them in there. Governor Wolf passed this ridiculous moratorium on death, on doing the death penalty and death warrants. Well, if it's so expensive to keep them locked up, let's have some more. Like the fact the Supreme Court.
To be fair to Governor Wolf, and I agree with your sentiment, perhaps, but Pennsylvania basically doesn't have the death penalty. There's only been 2 people executed, and they said, "I don't want any more appeals," and it's been 40 years.
Yeah, and he's got a good point in that the process needs cleaned up. It absolutely does, so that we're not having endless appeals and appeals and appeals. Mm-hmm. But if it's going to be deterrent at all, death by incarceration versus death by lethal injection or something else, we've got to look at what the best answer is.
I think part of the problem that needs to be addressed in the conversation is that not everyone has the same access to justice, and so I'm thinking of Giovanni Reed, for example. When he went to trial, he was offered 25 to 50 years in prison if he were to plead guilty. And he rejected the offer because in his mind, he was innocent and the truth would come out at trial. That didn't happen. He was convicted and he got the mandatory life sentence. Ended up spending 26 years in prison, only, for the Supreme Court to make this ruling, and then he get out. So in my mind, it's like, well, what's the difference between him serving 26 years and getting relief from that life sentence because of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling? What's the difference between that and him having accepted the plea offer of 25 to 50? Because either way you look at it, he, would be free today. And so, I think that there are some people who are given a break, some people who, similar scenario, similar set of facts, but they have an attorney who will advocate for them, who will push for the DA. If you're
more
rich,
likely to have a favorable outcome. And the Associated Press published a study that actually is factoring into this whole death penalty moratorium issue that said that overwhelmingly, if you have a public defender, you're going to be more out of luck than someone who doesn't. And how do we look at that in that whole system?
Absolutely.
And I just find myself thinking of a 17-year-old who's going out to hang out with their friends, and 2 guys pull up in the front, and he goes and jumps in a car, and he doesn't know, but one of the buddies is going to rob a bank or do something, and a gun goes off, and he's there with them, and by the law, he is a participant.
Right. Mm-hmm. Which is, and the tough thing about this conversation is there is such a disparity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have that, but that is not the case every single time.
Right.
But no system designed by man will ever be perfect.
No.
So we can't throw everything out. We need to doesn't need cleaning up. I think I think
throw
very
the
few
baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. I think very few people would disagree that sure, the system could be tweaked and made better. But at the same time, we can't. That's why I think the Supreme Court is a horrific decision to go back and say now we need to go retroactively, and we can't. It'd be no different than hey, I get a phone call and I go, hey, remember last week when you were driving 35 miles an hour in that 35 zone? We decided it's 25, so now we're going to ding you more. That would be just as unfair as what they're trying to do here by reducing these guys' sentences in some cases.
Having said that, and this is where we go back and forth. I mean, and I've met the Giovanni Reeds. There are people, and this is why we have to go case by case, that some could argue he spent 26 years for a murder he didn't commit, maintained his innocence throughout, and if not for that ruling, he'd still be behind bars, and that would not be just. And there's several of him to talk about. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the one that you're here to talk about, who may very well be resentenced to 80 years for all we know, which it would be, in effect, a life sentence.
A man who confessed to all of those horrible things.
Yes.
He confessed.
Well, and the uncertainty is what I think can be devastating in those cases for the families.
Right. Because that's the thing is, that's the one thing. I mean, they are very, very concerned. We've been given assurances from the DA that, they're going to do their best. But, at the end of the day, it's going to rest on some guy in a black robe sitting up there who could say, go ahead. So, and we're not very comfortable with that. And who knows what he's going to do.
And for someone else, it could go the other way, where the fate of being locked up forever is sitting with some guy or some woman in a black robe. And the subjective nature of it is why we have such differences from state to state and why we're sitting around a table talking about this today.
But do we have it right moving forward now? I mean, so based on the Supreme Court ruling, if you're a juvenile, you will not get the mandatory life. Is that correct?
Yes. I think it's a step in the right direction. And I know we're talking about juveniles, but I'm totally opposed to mandatory life for the crime of second-degree murder. I think it is reprehensible that a person could be held liable for someone else's actions. That's just really mind-blowing to me. But specifically as far as juveniles, I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm also not a fan of the life without parole tail, as I call it, that's attached, as the maximum penalty.
So if they say 30 to life, that's called a life tail.
Yes, and so that juvenile would have to be incarcerated for 30 years, and then at the expiration of those 30 years, they could go up for review by the parole board, and then if granted parole, they would be on parole for the rest of their life. I don't know that I like that, but it's better than what we had before. Because there's still that mandatory element in there. We just don't want to let go of this mandatory sentencing scheme. But it's a bit better.
But at some point, you do have to have standards.
Right. Well, the reason for that is because we said you can have that judge who says, yeah, again, you killed a busload of kindergartners and 10 years is enough. And the community would be outraged, and then that case is done. There's nothing you can do about it. So it's a legislature's way of trying to ensure minimum standards. Now, maybe they need to come up with, it needs to be looked at how the sentencing guidelines are set up. That they need to say, okay, there's aggravating circumstances. Did you, was there sexual assault involved? Did you, and just maybe those need to be strengthened so that the minimums can be reasonable, but then those aggravating circumstances can make it to, 10, 20, 30 years are tacked on, so maybe somebody gets 60 to whatever it might be.
But then for all the time we spend talking about how each case is different case by case, when you have a mandatory minimum, that takes away some of the nuance from case to case. Well, that is an argument you can make.
And it's hard to make the argument that the laws are too tough when last month, for Domestic Violence Month, I met the man whose sister was murdered by her University of Pennsylvania professor in Philadelphia. He was given 5 to 10. Heinous murder, and he almost got out at 5, if not for the family complaining about it,
and
that made it stay till 10.
When we talk about domestic violence, and that's a whole, we could do
podcast.
A whole separate episode.
And that's why we have minimums, for exactly that reason, because that crazy judge Dennis just mentioned.
But listen to how unfair that is to me. I think his name was Professor Rob. He murdered his wife, and the sentence was 5 to 10. But then you have a 14-year-old kid who was present at the scene of a robbery who did not pull the trigger but gets sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. That's absurd to me.
That's why it needs cleaned up. I mean, I don't think people will deny, and that's, but some of this is happening now.
But I don't know if we can clean up economics and class structure in our society. This guy was a university tenured professor, I believe, at the University of Penn. And so there's just certain things he can buy that the inner city kid in South Philly can't.
For Frank's case, that attorney that Waters had was one of the top attorneys in the area.
He was considered one of the foremost attorneys in the state. And he's a very middle-class family, idyllic, upbringing, and he still got the book thrown at him, So...
Anyway,
Frank, how's the family doing as you head into this? Are you guys just trying to mentally prepare yourselves? How are you guys feeling?
It's nerve-wracking. Everybody's, we're trying to come up with things like impact statements, and having to stand up and rip open, pour your heart out before the judge and hope he hears you is everybody's kind of quietly focusing on their own things and trying to not look at it too hard, because as soon as you do, it just, is a whole outpouring of emotions.
Okay.
Any final thoughts?
We're all looking at you.
No pressure.
Well, I had one other thing. When you said about, the second degree, and I do agree with you to a certain point. It's something maybe needs looked at, but at the same time, something an old expression that I've always lived by, and I've lived my life by, it is, all that's necessary for evil to win in this world is for good men to stand by and do nothing. And that's why, like, my kids will sometimes, Dad, why are you pulling over to do, Dad, why are you doing that? Stay out of that. I've fixed more tires that weren't mine in my lifetime, and it goes on and on and on. When those people are in that situation, it's your job to stand up. And I was a kid once upon a time too. I remember standing up and saying, hey guys, whoa. We that's not cool. We're not doing that. So, either get yourself out of that situation, or better yet, stand up and stop it. I've stopped situations when I was that age. Now, not everybody can do that, but I think that's what the law is all about. Is that
not everyone.
Well, and if you've known nothing else, so if you grew up in a family, so it sounds like your kids have this great example and this great role model, and they know that they have the ability to stop that. If you've been surrounded in an environment where that's actively discouraged, do you still have that same expectation?
But everybody knows, from the time you're very, very young, killing is wrong. If somebody's about to kill somebody, red lights and sirens and flags should be going off in your head. So, I don't know. I have a hard, as much as I can agree with you that, maybe the sentencing guidelines need cleaned up. But at the same time, I just can't see washing my hands of any culpability just because I didn't pull the trigger. Something still.
Well, we're not saying any culpability, but if you've served 15 or 20 years, that's culpability.
Maybe, but I trust my legislatures to mostly do the right thing with a lot of nudging from us people. Yes, they need that.
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us today.
Thank
really
you for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
Thank you.
Now it's time for a word from you, the comments and questions you sent us this week. We did get a voice memo from friend of the podcast, Jake Miller. He is a teacher who actually organized recently a debate that Dennis and I both were able to
He puts
help
his civics
facilitate.
lessons into practice.
Yes, a debate for county row offices. But this is about our last episode about the Me Too movement, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. So let's play Jake's thoughts on that.
Hi, this is Jake Miller. I'm a teacher in Hampton Township. I just wanted to voice in and say that this was another fantastic podcast that you just had last week, the hashtag Me Too movement highlighting sexual assault. But there are a few things that I wanted to bring up to share with your listeners. First of all, as a teacher, I think the most impactful thing for me as a man leading the classroom is that it's disturbing to think that many of my 8th grade students, their first hashtag Me Too moments of sexual assault and or just having sexual abuse is like now when I teach them in 8th grade or maybe a few years ago when they came in as 6th graders. And I think we all really need to understand that needs to be a teachable moment both in the classroom and at home. And secondly, I find it hard for people to back away from this issue saying it's political. Both the right has been affected by this with Bill O'Reilly settling out of court to pay off accusers and President Donald Trump, of course, being accused of inappropriate gestures and statements towards women. But those on the left, too, with Mr. Weinstein, as you mentioned on your podcast, but also former President Bill Clinton, who was accused of definitely more than his fair share. So I don't understand how people could put on the white gloves to back away from this, saying it's a political issue when it's really an American issue and a cultural issue. And lastly, to change that, if we want to move forward, just to look at some past movements, I think we need to impact the audience. That means people who aren't affected by this. So the civil rights movement, most people don't know, got its best footing when white people finally started to get on board with the black folks who were highlighting how they were treated inappropriately. And most recently, the gay rights movement, I feel, definitely had its soldiers to highlight and defend those who were mistreated and wanted equal rights, including equal marriage. But it wasn't until straight people got on board to say, this is wrong. So until men get on board and say, this is wrong, I don't know how far we're going to get. Again, thank you for a wonderful podcast, and I will be listening in the future.
He makes a good point.
Dennis, you look pensive.
Nothing left to add to that.
Yeah.
That was excellent.
One of so I was going through the Facebook comments about actually a different Me Too article we posted.
Okay.
About a lawmaker who she was talking about how she has been harassed as part of her job. And I did want to address some of the comments that were flying around about that because we didn't really get into it in our last episode.
Federal or state?
Federal. So we had someone on Facebook, kind of in a more mocking fashion, say, about 16 years ago, I was at a local bar and a woman sat down beside me and said, that looks good. What are you drinking? Yeah, I know I never reported it, but sometimes I look back and feel like I enabled the abuse of others by remaining silent. And it's the whole idea that, I guess that your place of work should be like a bar. But it's a lot of the ways that what women are saying right now still get discounted. And that's something I think that's pretty easy to overlook.
Well, I think he's missing the point. The point is that women don't talk about it because they feel like they're only going to get more of a backlash about it. And that's why they say, oh, it happened 16 years ago. I never said anything. It's not, you don't diminish what happened to them. And there's a reason they didn't speak up.
And it's not just someone saying you look good. It's someone who, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, also has a physical power over you. So you're sitting there wondering, okay, you're touching me and I don't like this. You have the ability to do a lot more, and I don't know if you're going to stop when I say stop.
Well, I think women have to stop thinking they need to be polite. Because I know in the past I've put up with things because you're like, I don't want to be rude or I don't want to make this situation awkward. And I think now we're getting to a point where women are like, I don't care anymore. I don't care. I'll embarrass this person. Because if you say something like, I don't like what you're doing, can you please stop? Then you think you're creating a more intense situation, or now this person's going to be embarrassed and they're going to lash out more. You know, those times are over. I think we need to stop trying to be polite and allow things to happen. Or not, I don't want to say allow, but
say something and let the chips fall where they may. I think there's a tendency to, and the argument that's really been bothering me that I've been thinking about over the last week has been, well, this is a witch hunt, and now, men are walking on eggshells and don't know what they can do. And to that I say, join the freaking club.
Yeah.
As women, if we smile at you, we're being flirty. If we don't smile, we're the B word. If we speak up about something, we're causing problems for someone. But if we don't speak up, then people say, why didn't you speak up? If our clothing is too frumpy, we don't get respected. But if it's too, quote, revealing, then we must be asking for it. If we raise our voices, we're being too aggressive. But if we're too soft-spoken, we're too meek. So we're used to walking on eggshells, and it can be a little hard sometimes to muster up sympathy that now there's a little more focus on men, and maybe you have to be careful with what you do too. And, maybe it is as simple as don't be pervy at work.
Ladies and gentlemen, she just did that. That was not read. There was no script. That was right off the top of her head with great
I've been
passion.
thinking about it a lot.
And I
we've been thinking
can't
about
disagree
it.
with a single word you said. And all I'm going to say is, guys, she just laid it out. So as Jake said, we need to take it to heart as well. If you'd like to check out the links to the stories, articles, and videos we discussed, you can find them in our show notes on our website, abc27.com. To get On Deadline delivered directly to your iPhone, tablet, or computer each week, subscribe in iTunes or Google Play Music. Please take a few minutes and leave us a review in iTunes. We do read them, and your thoughts help us figure out what we're doing well and what we can improve upon. If you have any news tips for the ABC27 investigators or any questions, topics you'd like us to discuss during our weekly podcast, please please send us a message on the ABC 27 Investigators Facebook page. Thanks so much to Eric Semmel for producing this podcast, Jason Dietz for composing and recording the music, but it is time for us to go because we're on deadline.